The suspect's name is Hisham. He came out peacefully and was taken into custody. The suspect, Hisham, was a roommate of Zamil, so that is where the connection lies.
The University of South Florida is alive the way it always is, backpacks swinging, coffee cups in hand, the low hum of a campus that never quite stops moving. Dissertations are being written. Lab hours are being logged. Somewhere across this campus, a doctoral student has his research open on his screen, deep in the final stretch of something he has spent years building toward. Nothing looks wrong. Nothing sounds wrong. Because on a Tuesday morning at a university, everything is supposed to feel exactly like this. But here is what no one on that campus knows yet. Two of the people who are supposed to be part of that rhythm are already gone. No sirens, no chaos, no yellow tape across a doorway, just two phones that have gone completely dark, two seats that are quietly, unremarkably empty, two lives that have simply stopped leaving a trace, and a world around them that hasn't noticed yet because everything still looks normal. That is the thing about true danger. It rarely announces itself. Sometimes it looks like an ordinary apartment in an ordinary neighborhood near an ordinary campus. Sometimes the most terrifying thing in a story is not what you can see, it is what you can't. Welcome back, and what you are about to hear is not a story about chaos or randomness. It is a story about proximity, about the danger that was already inside the door, about the signals that were there long before anyone thought to look for them, and about 5 discoveries that, when placed side by side, painted a picture that investigators describe as one of the most chilling they had encountered. This is the story of Zamil Limon Nahida Bristy. 2 doctoral students, 2 people with futures, with families, with everything ahead of them, and an apartment that held secrets no one on the outside could see, until it was far too late. Stay with me. 2 doctoral students, 2 people with futures, with families, with everything ahead of them, and an apartment that held secrets no one on the outside could see, until it was far too late. Before we talk about what investigators found, we need to talk about who they were looking for. Because in stories like this, it is very easy to let the evidence take over, the timelines, the search histories, the forensic details, and forget that at the center of all of it are 2 human beings who deserved far better than what happened to them. Zamil Limon was not a headline. He was a doctoral student in the final stretch of his thesis, months of research, late nights, the kind of focused discipline that only comes from someone who genuinely believes in what they are building. He was close, not in the vague, someday sense. Close in the way where you can actually see the finish line, where the work you have poured years into is finally taking its final shape. He was an international student, far from home, embedded in an academic community that was supposed to be a place of safety and growth. Nahida Bristy carried the same energy, driven, consistent, the kind of person whose presence in a room was reliable, which is exactly why her absence, when it came, registered as something deeply wrong to the people who knew her schedule. She moved through her days with purpose. She had a future mapped out, a degree within reach, a family waiting on the other side of it all. Think about that for a moment. Both of them had crossed oceans to be here. Both of them had made the kind of sacrifice that only people chasing something real are willing to make, leaving everything familiar behind, building a life from scratch in a new country, with new pressures and new challenges, because the goal on the other side was worth it. That is not a small thing. That is an act of extraordinary commitment. And the people they left behind knew it. A sibling describes the phone calls that stopped coming. Not dramatically, not all at once, just the slow, creeping realization that the calls were not being returned, that the messages were sitting unread, that something in the rhythm of communication had broken. When you are separated from someone you love by thousands of miles, that rhythm is everything. It is the thread that holds the distance together, and when it snaps, you know. A parent describes the moment the news arrived. There are no words that adequately capture what that moment feels like. The world does not end loudly. It caves in quietly, completely, and without warning. One moment you are waiting for your child to call. The next moment, someone is telling you why they never will. These are not background details. These are the people this story is truly about. And it is important, it is necessary that you hold on to them as we move forward, because what comes next is going to get darker, and it is easy to lose the human center of a story when the evidence starts piling up. So hold on to Zamil, hold on to Nahida, keep them close. Now the apartment. It was not a dramatic space. Nothing about it would have made you look twice if you had walked past it. A standard off-campus apartment, the kind that hundreds of students across the country live in, shared walls, shared routines, the kind of space where two people coexist in close quarters, learning each other's habits simply by proximity. Who leaves early? Who stays up late? Who is home on a Tuesday afternoon and who is not? That last part matters more than it might seem right now. The apartment was shared. Zamil was not living alone. He had a roommate, a man named Hisham Abuaria, and the two of them occupied the same physical space, navigated the same daily rhythms, passed each other in the same hallways. From the outside, it was just another student living arrangement. Unremarkable, ordinary. The kind of setup that thousands of graduate students across the country navigate every single semester. But inside that apartment, something had been building. And when investigators finally entered that space, when they crossed the threshold and began to look carefully at what was there, what they found bore no resemblance to the ordinary student living space it was supposed to be. They found 5 things, 5 discoveries, each one darker than the last, each one adding another layer to a picture that was becoming impossible to look away from. Let's start at the beginning. 3 days before Zamil and Nahida were reported missing, someone made a series of searches using artificial intelligence. Not for academic research, not for coursework. The searches were deliberate, sequential, and they covered a very specific set of topics: how to conceal a body, how decomposition works across different environments, the likelihood of forensic detection, and how authorities go about identifying human remains. Read that again slowly, because it deserves to land. These were not isolated curiosities. They were not random searches that happened to sit near each other by coincidence. They formed a chain, a logical, sequential chain of inquiry that followed a single, chilling thread from one question to the next. Someone was not just asking questions. Someone was doing research. And then the disappearances happened. And then the searches continued. After Zamil and Nahida went missing, whoever was behind those searches kept going. New questions appeared: whether vehicles are checked at a nearby state park, and what exactly the legal definition of a missing, endangered adult means under Florida law. Think about what that tells you. Before the disappearances, someone is researching how to conceal what happens to a body and how to avoid forensic detection. After the disappearances, that same someone is researching whether their vehicle might be checked in a location they may have visited, and what threshold of evidence the law requires before a missing person becomes a priority case. That is not impulsive behavior. Impulsive behavior does not have a research phase. Impulsive behavior does not pause after the fact to investigate the investigative process. What those searches represent, placed in sequence and in context, is something investigators rarely get to see laid out so clearly: a documented thought process, before the act and after it. Now, who was in that apartment? This is where the second discovery becomes impossible to separate from the first. Hisham Abuaria was not a stranger. He was not someone who needed to find a way in, who needed to scout a location, who needed to calculate access. He was already inside. He was Zamil's roommate. He shared the apartment. He shared the daily rhythms. He knew exactly when Zamil was home, when Nahida might visit, when the apartment was occupied and when it was quiet, when someone was likely to walk by and when no one would. In investigations, that kind of proximity is never treated as neutral. It is not a coincidence to be noted and set aside. Proximity is access. Proximity is information. Knowing someone's schedule is knowing their vulnerability, when they are alone, when they are distracted, when the timing works, and when it does not. Living with someone strips away every layer of uncertainty that an outsider would have to work around. And investigators, looking at those ChatGPT searches and then looking at who shared that space, found themselves staring at an alignment that was very difficult to explain away. But there was more, because Hisham Abuaria was not someone without a past. This is the third discovery, and it is the one that makes everything feel, in retrospect, both more disturbing and more preventable. Before this case, there was a documented history, incidents of violence within personal relationships serious enough to require legal intervention, restraining orders, conflicts with people in his immediate living environment, complaints from family members describing long-standing, uncontrollable patterns of tension and escalation. Some of those records were no longer visible in standard background searches. They had been handled through first-time offender programs designed with good intentions to allow people who make mistakes early in life a path forward without a permanent record following them. The convictions were expunged. The paper trail was cleared. But here is what investigators and legal scholars will tell you about expungement. It erases the record. It does not erase the pattern. And the pattern was still there for anyone willing to look backward carefully enough. Conflict, escalation, formal intervention, a period of surface calm, and then resurgence. That cycle repeated, not once, not twice. A cycle and cycles, as anyone who has studied behavioral history will tell you, rarely break on their own. They require something to interrupt them, something to change, something that in this case had not happened. Now, and this is the fourth discovery, the quietest one, and perhaps the most haunting. While Zamil was still alive, he had said something. Not loudly, not formally. There were no police reports, no official complaints, no documented requests for a room change or a housing intervention. Just a person in conversation, using the words available to him to describe something that felt wrong. He described his roommate as unpleasant, unapproachable. He mentioned communication problems. He suggested, without drama or alarm, that something about living in that space was not right. In a student housing environment, those words are easy to absorb without acting on them. Roommate tension is common. Personality clashes happen all the time. People get on each other's nerves in close quarters, and most of the time, it amounts to nothing more than an uncomfortable few months until one person moves out or the lease ends. And so what Zamil said was heard and set aside. No room change was arranged. No one escalated the concern. The signal disappeared into the noise of ordinary student life, the way small signals so often do, and no action followed. Sit with that for a moment. Because in retrospect, knowing what was found in that apartment, knowing what those searches said, knowing the history that existed on the other side of that shared wall, what Zamil said does not read like a casual complaint anymore. It reads like one of the earliest visible signs that something dangerous was developing. A warning, offered quietly by someone who perhaps did not fully understand the weight of what he was sensing. A warning that went unanswered. And then the fifth discovery, the one that turned everything from a missing persons case into something else entirely. When investigators entered the apartment, they were not looking at a single contained scene. What they found were biological traces spread across multiple areas of the space, a pattern that, in forensic terms, indicates movement. Not one moment in one place, multiple moments, multiple locations within the same apartment. Something had happened in more than one area of that space, and the evidence of it had spread accordingly. Personal items belonging to both Zamil and Nahida were found displaced. Wallets, identification cards, items tied directly to who they were as individuals, found not where they should have been, but in locations they had no reason to occupy. Some were discovered in areas designated for disposal. In investigations, the deliberate separation of a person from their identifying documents is treated as a conscious act. Wallets do not wander. Identification cards do not relocate themselves. When those items are found somewhere other than where their owner kept them, somewhere they had to be moved, that movement tells investigators something. It speaks to intentionality, to a decision made by someone about those objects after something had already happened. And then there were the purchases. Certain items found inside the apartment had been acquired in the days immediately preceding the disappearances. When investigators mapped the timeline of those purchases against the timeline of the ChatGPT searches, the two timelines did not sit independently of each other. They aligned. The searches and the purchases moved together as if one informed the other. Research followed by acquisition. Questions about what would be needed, followed by the procurement of what was needed. When Hisham Abuaria was questioned by investigators, he offered an account of events, and that account did not hold, not at the edges, not in the details, not in the ways that matter most when you are being asked to explain yourself against a body of physical and digital evidence that has already begun to speak very clearly. The inconsistencies in his statements were not minor clarifications or gaps in memory. They were structural, the kind of contradictions that emerge when a story being told does not match the story the evidence is telling. And that is the moment when all 5 discoveries stop being 5 separate things. Because investigators do not solve cases by looking at evidence in isolation. They solve them by looking at how evidence speaks to other evidence. And when they placed all 5 of these discoveries side by side, the search history, the proximity, the behavioral past, the warning Zamil gave, and what the apartment itself revealed, they were not looking at a collection of unrelated facts. They were looking at a sequence. The ChatGPT timeline aligned with the purchase records. The purchase records aligned with what the crime scene revealed. The crime scene aligned with the behavioral history. The behavioral history aligned with the proximity. And the proximity aligned with everything Zamil had quietly said before the world stopped listening to him. Each piece pointed in the same direction, toward one person, with a logic that was coherent and cumulative and very, very difficult to argue against. But we need to go back to the day it happened, because there is a chapter in this story that deserves its own space. A chapter about 30 hours, and about how the world managed to miss what was happening even as it was unfolding. April 16th. Zamil was at his desk working on his thesis. He had told people he needed to focus, that he would be less available, that he was pushing hard to get through a difficult stretch of his research. That was not unusual for him. That was just who he was. Nahida was in class, moving through her schedule the way she always did, consistent, purposeful, present. At some point that day, both of their phones went dark. Almost simultaneously. And here is what made those 30 hours so dangerous, how individually explainable the silence seemed. Zamil had already told people he would be harder to reach. Of course he was not answering, he was working. Nahida had a demanding schedule, of course there was a delayed response. Neither silence on its own was alarming. Neither absence viewed in isolation was enough to trigger concern. No single person had enough information to connect the two silences into one alarm. And so the hours passed. 1 hour became 5. 5 became 15. 15 became 30. A full day and more during which the outside world remained completely unaware. And whatever had happened inside that apartment stayed sealed from view behind a door that looked exactly like every other door on the block. This is something worth thinking about, not as a criticism of the people in Zamil and Nahida's lives, but as a structural reality about the way danger can hide inside plausibility. When a person has a reasonable explanation for their silence, that explanation becomes a shield, not intentionally, not maliciously, but functionally. It holds the alarm at bay just long enough. And by the time the explanation stopped being convincing, 30 hours had already gone. The bodies of Zamil Limon and Nahida Bristy were later located. Their families, who had been waiting on the other side of an ocean for a phone call that never came, received the news that every family in that situation dreads more than anything else in the world. The degree was never completed. The thesis was never finished. The futures they had crossed oceans to build were taken from them inside an apartment that was supposed to be a place where they lived and studied and moved forward. Hisham Abuaria was arrested and charged in connection with their deaths. A case built on 5 discoveries, on digital evidence and forensic evidence and behavioral history, and the words of a young man who had tried, in the quiet language of ordinary discomfort, to say that something felt wrong. And that brings us to the only thing left to say. Because this story does not end in a courtroom. It does not end with an arrest or a charge or a verdict. Those are important things. They matter to justice. They matter to the families. They matter enormously, but they are not where the lesson lives. The lesson lives here, in the space between the warning and the outcome. Zamil said something. He told someone. He described, in the words he had available to him, a feeling that something in his living situation was not right. And the world heard him and filed it away under roommate tension and moved on. Here is the uncomfortable truth that this case asks all of us to sit with. Danger does not always arrive loudly. It does not always come with obvious warning signs, with dramatic escalations, with moments that are impossible to miss. Sometimes it arrives as a small discomfort, an unease you cannot fully explain, a feeling that something is off even though nothing concrete has happened yet, a quiet statement from someone you know that sounds like a complaint but might be something more. The earliest warning systems available to any person are not external. They are internal. They are the part of you that senses something before you can name it, that registers wrongness before the evidence shows up to confirm it. And we are very good, all of us, at talking ourselves out of those signals, at finding the reasonable explanation, at deciding it is probably nothing, that we are being dramatic, that people would think we were overreacting if we said something. Zamil was not overreacting, and the cost of treating what he said as ordinary was not ordinary at all. If you are living somewhere that feels wrong, say it loudly. If someone in your life tells you their space feels unsafe, treat it as more than a complaint. If your instincts are pulling you toward concern, let them. The evidence does not always arrive before the danger does, and waiting for it to become obvious is sometimes waiting too long. Zamil Limon Nahida Bristy deserved to finish what they came here to build. They deserved the futures they had worked so hard and traveled so far to reach. They deserved to make those phone calls home, to hear their families' voices, to walk across a stage and receive what they had earned. They did not get that, but the people listening to this story still can, still have time, still have the ability to pay attention, to take the quiet signals seriously, to make the call that needs to be made before silence becomes permanent. This has been the story of Zamil and Nahida. Remember their names.